This is a quiet story, told slowly. There's nothing you need to do, and nothing you need to remember. You can listen closely, or let the words fade into the background as you rest. The story will move gently, without sudden moments, and it will stay with you whether you're awake or drifting off. Tonight's story is The Lighthouse That No Longer Warned. Thomas Hale had not expected to stay. The lighthouse was meant to be a temporary arrangement, a practical solution to a practical problem. The previous keeper had retired without much notice, and the coastal authority needed someone to mine the light until a replacement could be found. Thomas had been between things then, his days loose and unstructured in a way that felt less like freedom and more like drift. He had agreed to a few weeks without giving it much thought. That was 6 months ago. Each morning, Thomas woke to the sound of water moving against rock, a steady presence that did not hurry itself. The sea below the cliffs was rarely loud here. It spoke in low repetitions, folding and unfolding against the stone, as though it were practicing patience. The light through the narrow windows shifted slowly with the hours, tracing familiar paths across the whitewashed walls. The lighthouse itself was older than most of the buildings in the nearby village. Its stone had darkened with years of salt and wind, and its iron fittings bore the marks of careful repair rather than replacement. Thomas had learned its habits quickly. Which steps creaked, which doors needed a firmer hand, how the spiral staircase held the cool even in summer. The light still worked, of course. It turned faithfully through the night, its beam cutting a pale arc across water and sky. Thomas checked it each evening as part of his routine, climbing the final stretch of stairs with the same measured pace he used for everything now. He cleaned the lens, checked the mechanism, logged the hour. The work was simple and repetitive, which suited him more than he would have expected. What had changed was not the lighthouse, but the sea. On clear nights, Thomas could see far beyond the usual markers. Ships passed at a greater distance now, their lights small and steady on the horizon. The shipping lanes had shifted years ago, guided by newer systems, quieter and more precise. The lighthouse remained, but it no longer stood in the path of regular travel. It no longer warned anyone. At first, that knowledge unsettled him. Lighthouses were built for purpose. Their reason for being was clear. A light without an audience felt like a question left unanswered. Thomas had found himself scanning the water more often than necessary, looking for signs of need that did not arrive. Over time, that unease softened. The days settled into a rhythm that required little decision. Thomas rose early, made tea, and stood by the narrow window facing east as the sky shifted from grey to pale blue. The village below woke slowly. A few lights came on. A door opened and closed. A dog moved along the lane with its owner, both small from this height. After breakfast, he walked the perimeter path around the base of the tower. The wind carried the smell of salt and wet stone. Gulls circled overhead, calling to one another without urgency. The cliffs held steady beneath his boot, their edges softened by grass and time. Inside, the rooms were spare, but comfortable. A small kitchen, a table, a narrow bed tucked against the curve of the wall. Thomas had brought little with him, a few books, clothes enough for the season. He had found that he needed less here. The lighthouse asked for presence, not possession. In the afternoons, he kept records. Weather conditions, visibility, The status of the light. Most days were uneventful. Clear skies, calm water, no incidents to report. Thomas wrote neatly, his handwriting steady and unhurried, as though the act of recording was an end in itself. Sometimes he paused while writing and listened. The lighthouse had its own sounds, distinct from the sea. The low hum of the mechanism, the occasional tick of cooling metal, the soft complaint of stone settling as temperatures changed. These sounds had become familiar companions, as reliable as breath. In the evenings, as the light faded, Thomas prepared the lamp. He moved with care, not because the task was difficult, but because it felt right to do so. He cleaned the glass, adjusted the housing, and climbed to the top as the first stars appeared. When he switched the light on, it responded without delay, casting its beam outward into the growing dark. Thomas often stood there for a while, after the work was done, hands resting on the rail, eyes following the slow sweep of light. It moved across empty water, illuminating nothing in particular. The beam returned again and again, patient and consistent. There was comfort in that consistency. On nights when the weather turned, the lighthouse came alive in different ways. Wind pressed against the stone. Rain traced paths down the windows. The sea grew louder, its voice carrying farther up the cliffs. Thomas remained inside, the walls holding firm around him. He trusted the structure. It had weathered worse. One evening, as he logged the weather, Thomas noticed something he had not paid attention to before. The previous entries, written in different hands over the years, told a gradual story. Mentions of near misses, of ships guided safely past dangerous shallows, of storms survived and signals answered. Then, slowly, the language changed. Fewer incidents, fewer references to vessels, more entries that mirrored his own. Clear, calm, no activity. The lighthouse had not failed. The world had simply moved on. Thomas closed the logbook gently and set his pen aside. He did not feel sadness exactly, more a quiet recognition. Things could remain useful even when their use changed. A light could still be a light, even if no one depended on it in the same way. That night, as the beam turned across the dark sea, Thomas did not search the horizon for distant light. He watched the rhythm instead, the steady return, the certainty of movement. The lighthouse no longer warned, but it still stood. Thomas wondered if that was enough. The following days passed without distinction, and Thomas found that he no longer marked them as carefully as he once had. The logbook still received its entries, written at the same hour, in the same neat hand, but the meaning he attached to them had shifted. They were no longer evidence of usefulness. They were simply records of presence. The weather remained steady. Clear mornings gave way to pale afternoons, and evenings settled without drama. The sea kept its low, repetitive voice, rising and falling against the rock in patterns too old to hurry. Thomas moved through his routines with a calm that surprised him when he noticed it. He was not waiting for anything anymore. One afternoon, while walking the perimeter path, he stopped at a point where the cliff curved inward, forming a small hollow, sheltered from the wind. From there, the lighthouse rose behind him, its stone catching the light in muted shades of grey and white. Ahead, the water stretched outward, unbroken and empty. Thomas sat on a low rock and rested his hands on his knees. He had brought no book, no notebook, no reason beyond the walk itself. He listened to the sea without translating its sound into thought. It did not feel like boredom. It felt like relief. When he returned inside, he noticed the quiet more clearly than before. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of demand. The lighthouse did not ask him to interpret it. It did not need reassurance. It simply existed, solid and unchanged, holding its place against time and weather alike. In the late afternoon, a visitor arrived. The knock at the door was gentle, more hesitant than insistent. Thomas opened it to find an older man standing just beyond the threshold, cap in hand, his jacket marked with salt stains and careful repair. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," the man said. Thomas shook his head. "No," he replied. "You're not." The man introduced himself as a former fisherman who had lived in the village all his life. He had walked up to the lighthouse out of habit, he explained, though he had not climbed the path in years. He glanced past Thomas into the interior, his eyes lingering on the spiral staircase. "I used to see the light from my boat," the man said. "Even when I didn't need it." Thomas nodded. He understood that kind of looking. They stood together for a few moments without speaking, both facing the sea. The wind moved around them, carrying the familiar scent of salt and stone. "It still turns," the man said quietly. "Yes," Thomas said. "Every night." The man smiled, a small expression that carried memory rather than joy. "That's good," he said. "Some things don't need to stop just because we don't look at them anymore." He thanked Thomas for the time, replaced his cap, and made his way back down the path without hurry. Thomas watched until he disappeared from view, then closed the door gently behind him. That evening, when Thomas lit the lamp, the action felt different. Not heavier, not lighter, simply settled. The beam moved across the water, as it always had, and Thomas followed it with his eyes, not searching, not expecting. He realized then that the lighthouse had changed him as much as it had revealed itself. He no longer measured his worth by response. He no longer waited for proof that what he did mattered. The light moved. The sea listened. That was enough. Later, as he wrote the final entry of the day, Thomas paused before closing the logbook. He added a line he had never written before. "Light steady. Keeper present." He closed the book and let the words stand without explanation. The night passed quietly. The wind softened. The stars emerged one by one. Thomas slept without interruption, held within walls that asked only that he remain. The storm arrived 2 nights later, not with violence, but with inevitability. Thomas had noticed the change in the air throughout the afternoon, the way the wind shifted direction and carried a sharper scent from the sea. The sky had thickened into a low grey ceiling, and the light in the lighthouse windows dulled earlier than usual. By evening, rain had begun to tap gently against the glass, a steady sound that grew more certain as the hours passed. Thomas moved through his preparations without haste. He secured what needed securing, checked the lamp housing, and made his entry in the logbook. The words remained simple. Visibility decreasing, wind rising, light operational. The act of writing steadied him, not because it altered anything, but because it placed him inside the moment. When the wind strengthened, the lighthouse answered with its familiar language. Stone held firm. Iron fittings complained softly. The staircase carried a faint vibration, as though the whole structure had learned to flex without giving way. Thomas had lived through storms in other places, in houses that creaked and shuddered as though afraid of their own age. Here, the sound was different. It was not fear. It was endurance. Near midnight, when the rain had become heavier and the sea's voice rose into a louder, rougher rhythm, Thomas climbed to the lantern room. The glass panes were streaked with water, and beyond them, the dark was dense. The light's beam turned steadily, carving a pale arc through rain and spray. For a few minutes, Thomas stood with his hands resting on the rail, watching the sweep. He could see almost nothing beyond the immediate reach of the light. The sea and sky had merged into one moving shadow. He was about to turn back when he saw a flicker that did not belong. At first, it looked like a brief reflection, a trick of water on glass. Then it appeared again, farther out, low on the horizon. A small light, unsteady and faint, rising and falling as though carried by waves. Thomas narrowed his focus without tensing. He did not feel alarm in the sharp sense. He felt attention sharpen into clarity, the quiet readiness that came from repetition and responsibility. He watched the light for several full sweeps of the beam. It remained. It moved slightly, drifting in a way that suggested it was not a distant ship in the shipping lane. It was closer, smaller, lower to the water. A boat, he thought. Someone too near the rocks. Thomas did not rush. He moved with the same careful pace he used for every task, because haste in a storm was another form of mistake. He descended the stairs, took the radio from its place, and switched it on. The familiar crackle answered, then steadied. He called the harbour station, voice calm, giving the coordinates as best he could from memory and sight. The response came quickly, professional and clear. They had already noted the change in weather. They would send a team. They asked him to keep the light steady, to continue observing. Thomas returned to the lantern room and resumed his watch. The light outside flickered again, then vanished briefly behind a wave, then returned. Thomas stayed at the glass, tracking it with his eyes, not forcing the gaze, letting it find the pattern. The lighthouse beam swept across the water, brightening the surface in shifting fragments. For a moment, it caught the boat. Small, dark, riding too close to the cliffs. The lighthouse, forgotten by most, had found its purpose again without announcing it. The harbour team arrived within the hour. Thomas saw their vessel's stronger lights cut through the rain, steady and confident. He watched the movement of their approach, the careful arc they took to avoid the worst of the rocks. The beam from the lighthouse continued its patient sweep, offering orientation without command. Eventually, the small boat's light moved closer to the harbour team's craft, then disappeared from sight behind their larger vessel. The rescue itself was not dramatic from this distance. It was simply motion and light, shapes meeting in dark weather and moving away together. Thomas breathed out slowly. He had been holding his breath without noticing. When the harbour radio crackled again, the voice on the other end confirmed what Thomas could already sense. The boat had been found. 2 people on board, cold, shaken, but alive. They had been heading in from further along the coast and misjudged the storm's shift. The lighthouse beam had helped them recognize where they were and had helped the rescue team locate them quickly. Thomas thanked the voice, then set the radio down. He remained in the lantern room for a long moment after that, watching the sea settle into its rough rhythm. The storm still held the night in its grip, but the urgency had passed. The beam continued its steady arc, illuminating rain, spray, and empty water with equal patience. When Thomas finally descended, he did so quietly. He made tea, though it was late, and held the mug in both hands, as if the warmth were part of the structure holding him up. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel a surge of meaning. He felt something calmer. He felt placed. In the morning, the storm had loosened. The rain became lighter, the wind less forceful. The sea remained restless, but its voice softened. Thomas walked the perimeter path as he always did, boots damp in the grass, air cold and clean. The lighthouse rose behind him, marked with fresh streaks where rain had run down the stone. He returned inside and opened the logbook to write the day's entry. His hand was steady. The words came without effort. Storm overnight. Light steady. Assistance requested and received. 2 recovered. No injuries reported. He paused, then added one final line. Light seen. Thomas set the pen down and closed the book. The room around him was quiet, filled with the familiar hum of the mechanism and the slow settling of stone. He felt the stillness return, not as emptiness, but as space. That evening, when he climbed the stairs to the lantern room and switched on the light, Thomas did not look for distant ships or expect flickers on the horizon. He watched the beam turn, steady and patient, moving across dark water with the same calm insistence as always. The lighthouse no longer warmed the world in the way it once had. Most nights, no one needed it. Most nights, no one looked. Still, it stood. Still, it shone. In its turning, Thomas found a quiet understanding that did not require proof to endure.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, share and subscribe. Thank you for supporting the channel.